Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 25th of April, 2024 year. A huge number of events took place today, a huge number of geolocations. And if someone asks when it starts, when the Russian offensive begins, which is being talked about by the Western media, Zelensky, Budanov and others, it seems that this offensive has already begun and is going on for several days. And this offensive is definitely being conducted in the Avdiivka and Donetsk directions. We will start with you from the locality of the Q, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to develop a bridgehead. Continue to develop an offensive. As you can see, we have updated the map. There is a very interesting geolocation, very interesting information. Let's start with you with Osheretin. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to strike. Archival footage of the beginning and continuation of hostilities is published. In these frames, for example, we can observe with you the calm movement of a Russian armored personnel carrier or Behi, which goes along the railway tracks from, let's say, Vostoknaya, southeastern outskirts in a northwesterly direction, so let's say further towards the settlement of Novoalexandrovka and Progress settlement. In this direction, in this movement, it is worth paying attention to the update on the deep state map. Today, they surprised everyone who generally monitors the situation, pointing out that these fields here are the situation. Let's say these areas in the area of the railway, almost to the village of Sokol and a little southeastern Novoalexandrovka. They paint in a gray zone. They are doing this on the basis of reports received yesterday that the armed forces of the Russian Federation tried to advance along the railway. But the Ukrainians managed to repel and stop the advance of the 100th, in my opinion, mechanized brigade, in the area of the settlement of Progress. But they changed the map anyway, because there is still a suspicion that the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to move far enough to the west, and, in general, create a fairly serious, let's say, control zone, and push the front line as far as possible, let's say, secure the flanks. And, in general, secure the situation and give time and opportunities for the fighters, both to continue the sweep of Ocheretin itself, and to continue the sweep and move down to Bakhmutovka and Solovyev. At the same time, I remind you, as we discussed yesterday, if this information is really confirmed, then at the moment it turns out that the position of the Russian army is located between two water barriers, that is, along the railway, and at the moment it is extremely, let's say small, very low, and there is little chance and low probability of that the armed forces of Ukraine as a whole will be able to overcome this line during counterattacks, since on the one side, on the other side, there is a river. Rivers and forest belts here, perhaps some former positions in the forest. In general, it is very stable here, and everything looks quite, let's say, appetizing from the point of view of, let's say, a long-term opportunity to defend, while fighting is underway in the main directions. I repeat it once again, it is Osheretino itself, and so it is Bakhmutovka and Solovyev. Footage continues to arrive of Russian fighters hoisting the flags of the Russian Federation in the central part of Osheretin. So far, according to the latest reports of the latest information, it has not yet been possible to completely clean up the settlement, or it is already possible. Perhaps this situation will end completely literally tonight, since, say, in the middle of the day, in the morning, more information was received about the control of certain districts, certain buildings of some kind. Perhaps someone did not have time to leave in a timely manner, got surrounded. In other words, a sweep is underway, but it seems that really tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation will finally put an end to the question of, let's say, the ownership of Osheretin. And then movement will begin in, say, the direction of the settlement of Arkhangelsk. And today, we have repeatedly received information that they have already started talking, let's say, some conversations are underway. Some moments are already underway, how to move on to this locality. Let me remind you that it is still on the Russian side of these water barriers, and in general, here it will, say, affect the speed and the higher chances that this locality will also be abandoned by the APU in the near future. Then we are moving with you to the south Novobakhmutovka Solovyova. Today, all cartographers, without exception, update maps showing that the settlement is under the full control of the Russian army. And of the main thing, it is worth paying attention, of course, to the shots of arming flags. Not only the Russian Federation, but also those units that participated in the sweep, storming of the settlement. Data frames, data has not been geolocated. It is very difficult to understand from this angle from the building exactly where the flag was hoisted. But according to the author of this video, it happened in the village of Novobakhmutovka. And here it is worth paying attention to very important shots. Here is this picture again. This is the same building then as before. As the frame was on the roof, there is already a frame at the foot. Pay attention. Here, let's say, there are two groups of soldiers. Some stand on the left in a green uniform, and some stand on the right with elements of a small brown, let's say, shape. And pay attention to the stripes of the fighters. That's exactly the identification marks on the armor. Please note that directly in Novaya Bakhmutovka, according to these frames, it can be concluded that the settlement was stormed, including with the participation of former Wagner fighters. Unless, of course, Wagner's former fighters exist. At the moment, they are performing under the flag of the Arbat division, including. And that is why it is very important, and perhaps this is also the main reason why the offensive in this direction developed so successfully, since the most trained, most experienced fighters who had already stormed settlements during, say, the previous stages of a special military operation were used and, let's say, took part here. Cartographers continue to update maps, forest belts on the locality itself, and of course. Now there's a question about the locality of Solovyev. Literally today, Russian sources publish footage of artillery strikes. A very short video. It's hard to understand what the point is that they tried to show these frames here. And then information begins to arrive that we are developing. It was published at 10 o'clock this morning that the fighting is now underway in the area of Tereshkov Street, the 40th anniversary of victory. That is, some separate fragments, separate individual pieces of information were thrown in. And already, literally again, information was received today, the first shots of how Ukrainian drones strike off drones at Russian soldiers in a gelicated form in this area. In other words, there is 100% confirmation, video confirmation, that Russian fighters stormed and were in the settlement itself. Of course, it's worth watching these shots. Here is this building, here is this building in Solovyev that they are trying to clean up. Perhaps there were fighters in the issue throwing grenades. In other words, here is such a story. There is an unambiguous confirmation. In general, a separate cartographer, individual experts like Ribber, already reports that Solovyova is under the full control of the Russian army, and here the 47th Mechanized Brigade tried, let's say, to start stabilization right from the saddle, but we see with you that it did not work. And it seems to me that the main reason is that no one wants to die, especially not for their land or for their area of responsibility. The 47th Brigade, and those who were here retreated in the direction of the nearest settlement. This is the village of Sokol, and at the moment, after the cleaning of Solovyev's turn, of course, there will be a question of where to move on. Of course, most military experts agree that this will be the settlement of Arkhangelsk Novokalinovaya ceramics, where, among other things, endless non-stopping battles are held daily. Then we move with you to Burdik. We have also updated the map on Pobdik. The first shots began to arrive already on Kasparov Street. We won't be watching them. In these shots, published by Ukrainian sources, fire damage is inflicted. Artillery strikes in the paradrones on Russian attack aircraft are already on this side of the Derniya River, and well in general. As if progress is on the face, yes. That is, the movement is underway, and in the near future, there will be a sweep of the north in the western part of Burdik, after which the Ukrainians will finally and irrevocably retreat from the settlement of Novoselovka I, Novopokrovskaya. And then the Russian army will think about how to move in these fields along this operational expanse under drone strikes, and how to further cling to the next settlement in order to get involved in the battle and continue to squeeze out the APU. We see with you that the offensive is gaining momentum. We see with you that the APU is not able to stabilize the situation. Of course, we are well aware that, say, the Ukrainian side, the Russian side will survive as much as possible. Squeeze out of this situation in order to prevent the stabilization of the front. They will push, 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 push with the possibility of finally turning the situation around, and then simply how the map will fall. How the situation will develop in general. Then we are moving with you to the next most important section of the front. This is the settlement of Krasnogorovka. As you can see, we have also updated the map here. At the moment, according to incoming information, the southern part, the railway part, the central part, the south-central part of the settlement is under full control. A separate cartographer assures that the Russian army has managed to move even further, even deeper, and in general. According to geolocations and, let's say, logic, it is generally clear, and most likely one can even agree, that these streets are really under the control of the Russian army. Well, it's not clear which ones can be controlled. There are simply no geolocations, so we don't change, yes. And today, among other things, the first shots of the Russian flag were published already in this brick factory, as everyone calls it. Here he waves his hands. We see with you that this is not hoisting a flag, this is waving, let's say, a flag. There are, of course, moments. It means that everything is not quite safe everywhere, and the territory is still being shot through. So it does not risk. Most likely, everything that is just to the north is still under control in the forest. That is, here there was a flag waving from the window. That is, we see here there is a small hangar of some kind, a depot. And then Krasnogorsk goes on to a refractory plant, most likely to a refractory plant still controlled by heights. Therefore, everything is being done very carefully in order not to, let's say, harm the personnel of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. During the day before this attack, the most powerful artillery training was carried out and information continued to arrive. Separate frames with messages from Ukrainian fighters who simply sat in basements all these days, did not climb out. At least the author recommended it to them, or whoever the commander of some unit was there. In general, the situation here was as complicated as possible, and some information was received, let's say, that the situation was as difficult as possible. Everyone was sitting in the basements, not climbing out, at least until the next day. And, of course, before the very beginning of the filming of how I started making this video, another footage was published. And here we already see a detailed version of the offensive. We see with you, this is a Russian turtle tank. This technology has been massively applied. They simply sheathe all the tanks, all the equipment of the Russian army in several layers, in several rows, in several lines. So that all types of weapons are already removed, most importantly, so that Ukrainians do not see what is under the armor. In these frames, we see with you just a huge movement of equipment, as if they are riding along the avenue, along the Arbat itself. A huge amount of equipment, tanks. Some come, the second leave, land troops. The landing begins to storm, there is a sweep, the equipment leaves for a new batch of stormtroopers. They come back, break down the walls, clear the passages. That's how the assault and the battle for Krasnogorovka took place. There is an extremely high probability that the Russian army already controls more than 50%, which is already possible now. Ukrainians are fleeing from the settlement due to such a massive, large, heavy, and in fact impossible to stop with pressure and so on. We see with you here in these frames, for example, just now Russian stormtrooper fighters who, after dismounting, already entered the brick factory itself and, say, the industrial zone in the vicinity. And after a successful landing, the equipment calmly, safely returned back, and then there was a new wave. Here we see more fighters landing. In general, the locality is already controlled as much as possible. There were battles here the flag was waved, here the landing took place in the second form in the stand. there were these turtle tanks. In other words, we see that the battles are being fought for the most important central part. There is no geolocation yet. Let's say there are battles for these hangars, for this place, where the highest, the most dense buildings are. But most likely these battles are taking place right now, in the fiercest struggle imaginable, and after breaking through this, let's say, this part, of course, everything will end in Krasnogorovka. There will be no fighting in the eastern part, as it will simply retreat from here. Because there will be a high probability of getting surrounded, and it will happen. And so on and so forth. In general, the situation is developing as much as possible in favor of the Russian army. Then we are moving with you to Uglidar, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to simply level the settlement with the ground as a mine, as Uglidar itself. Brosa fly fabs, everything flies. Another explosion, another 1.5 or to 500 arrived. And in Uglidar itself, footage of a strike is also published, most likely by Moore, or by something very powerful. At the point of temporary deployment, at the observation point, the most advanced southwestern position. That is, before that, the Ukrainian positions were equal in the area of farms, in the area of these dachas. Now the focus has shifted slightly to the north, closer to high-rise buildings. In other words, everything, without exception, tells us that literally in the next, perhaps even seconds, the Russian army will begin to storm Uglidar in the 5th, or perhaps already in the 6th attempt. And there is an extremely high probability that this attempt will already be the last. And then we are moving with you to the harvest, and here, including the Russian army, simply inflicts a massive fire defeat on the settlement. They strike with fabs, artillery, they hit with Malki, they hit with everything that is possible. Just to take apart all the supports of the Apu into pieces, and, among other things, let's say, under the sounds, under the blows of artillery, the Russian army of course made repeated attempts to storm. And during the next offensive operation, managed to improve its position in the southern part of the settlement. Let me remind you that the last extreme position of the Russian army was located in this building. And today, we receive footage of how Russian equipment, Russian Beha, drives into the next group of buildings to land troops, turns around and leaves. In other words, we can conclude with you that the Russian army is actually already entering tightly, thoroughly, into the southern part of the harvest, and in the near future there will be, among other things, the fiercest bloody battles on it. And the purpose of the post is to regain control of the Russian army over all the territories that were lost during the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and then reach Velikaya Novoselovka. Derivka, of course, and Velikaya Novoselovka. This is not just an operation, it is to return from the territory that Ukraine managed to take during the Ukrainian offensive. This is an operation called the Great Novoselovka. This is the stronghold, after which there will be an attempt to move on to Kurakov, or perhaps surround the Kurakovskaya grouping. Since we see the fall of Krasnogorovka, and then, naturally, the Russian army will rest against these strongholds. In these cities of Kurakova, Maximilievka, Gest, Kurakovka, Gurnik, Karlovka, there are a large number of strong points, rivers, water barriers, a railway. And it will be extremely difficult to take them head-on by storm, so, of course, the Russian army will try to implement a plan for, say, a strike on Velikaya Novoselovka. And after Velikaya Novoselovka further north in the direction of Bogadir and Alexievka. In the case of the successful development of this offensive, and this may happen, of course, the Apu will not hold on to Kurakov. Perhaps it will no longer be a retreat, perhaps it will already be a flight. Zaporozhye direction. The exchange of blows continues, the exchange of artillery strikes continued. Nothing significant was happening. And, of course, further, we cannot bypass the direction called the Kherson direction, where the armed forces of Ukraine have become as active as possible, inflicting, let's say, the maximum possible fire damage with the use of drones on the settlements of Kurakovka and Novokakhovka. But among other things, in addition to this focus, it is also worth paying attention to the situation that is unfolding in the Krynik area. All practical cartographers have already painted over the Krinky as information begins to arrive again. That the armed forces of Ukraine have again landed troops on the Crimean bridgehead. Shots are being published from the Russian side, as alleged artillery strikes are being carried out on the positions of the Afu again on the Russian side of the Dnieper River. But again flags are being published, some attempts to storm, counterattack. In general, there is an impression that the Apu, seeing that the situation in the Avdiivka area, in the Yuzhno-Donetsk area, the direction is extremely sad. And now, in my opinion, there is an understanding that no matter how much you throw firewood into this inferno, everything will burn instantly. The only correct way out, which the Ukrainian command now sees for itself, is to try to reopen the front in Kherson. In order to delay Savdivsky from the Donetsk direction at least one artillery installation. And then it may be easier for the armed forces of Ukraine to breathe in the Avdiivsky and Donetsk directions. Therefore, here for sure, the 37th, 36th, 35th, 38th Brigades will again try to storm. But due to the extremely high activity of drones in the settlements of Kakhovka, Novaya Kakhovka, Tavriisk, here, first of all, there is a bigger, stronger, and bigger city. And there is an extremely high probability in connection with this activity that you may be trying to land troops here, too, in order to keep not just, say, these prefabricated shield houses that we saw in the markets, but more or less high-rise buildings, so that it would be easier to somehow defend and possibly repel a counteroffensive and attempts to squeeze out from the Russian Federation. But in general, we see with you here, we should not underestimate the extremely many chances for the Apu to hold these bridgeheads, even when trying to create them, but there is simply no other way out. Then we return back towards the Yar clock, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation, according to separate sources, have completed the formation of, say, an assault attacking fist, which will be involved in the near future. Based on the frames and geolocations that you and I see, we can make a clear conclusion that now all the Boyar direction has been put on an operational pause. Of course, most likely this is due to the fact that there is a regrouping. Of course, yoga women fly, drones fly in, but again there are no serious assaults. Although again, I repeat, according to the sources, everything is already ready before the final blow to the watchmaker. Surely something is expected, perhaps finally a breakthrough in the Okhortinsky direction. Perhaps the beginning of the Kharkiv Sumy operation is also expected. Well, that is, at the moment when the Apu will be forced to take reserves from somewhere that do not exist. And then this strike will take place in order to finally nail, let's say, on the ground. Not to give the opportunity to move and do something. Razdolovo-Seversk direction is still going like this. It seems there are some activities, artillery strikes, but well, it feels like there is still a lot of work to be done here. A lot of people in the forest are holding on to the direction, and so far no one is planning to retreat from here. South Kapinski direction, no information. The Central Kapinski information is received that all the crossings that were set up in a couple of weeks have begun to be destroyed again. And it is along the Oskol River that is being destroyed in order to disrupt, let's say, rotations. Disrupt the supply of reinforcements. Perhaps something will start here in the near future. From the interesting, of course, we continue to follow and observe Kharkov. There is a Russian army slightly changed tactics. If in the previous week, when they said that Russia would attack in the Kharkiv direction, there the Russian team pretended that, like, why? We are not going there, or were silent at all. In other words, they hinted there, maybe something with the aim of trolling more, or something like that. But today, let's say, to some extent, the cards have been opened because the Russian army, let's say, at the maximum possible speeds, the maximum possible possibilities are being inflicted. It is important to track construction equipment, those units of equipment that are involved primarily in the construction of defensive structures. Because, again, I repeat, there is an extremely high probability that the Russian army will not undertake any offensives before the holidays. And that, is 2 more weeks. In 2 weeks, you can dig so many trenches, yes, that then you will get tired of storming them all. Therefore, now there is a task, if there is an offensive after the holidays, to track and destroy construction equipment, so that they simply could not dig if you rotate with shovels. But of course you can't dig a lot with shovels, right? At the same time, information is being received from the Ukrainian side that Russian troops are concentrating as much as possible on the Sumy and Kharkiv directions, and in the near future, they are again expected to strike. Ukrainians report that the evacuation of the hospital administration, personal files, documents, prosecutors' affairs, personal administrative affairs has begun. Everyone is already starting to take out business, is slowly starting to leave Kharkiv. And this, among other things, is an extremely high signal, a convincing signal that something may start here. In particular, shots of the Sumy-Kiev highway with large columns of equipment that Ukrainians are transferring at the border are published. We see Humvees with you, light equipment. We don't see Bradley here with you, we don't see tanks. There may even be nothing to throw. But what is there? They are already throwing it at the border. There is an extremely high probability that some kind of offensive will begin here in the near future. Well, we'll watch with you. Mobilization centers in Kiev operate 24/7. It is reported that a huge number of shopping mall workers from all over Ukraine have been driven to Kiev now, of course. Since no one has ever touched Kiev in their lives, it is clear that this is an untouched nest. And here it is possible to cut down several thousand, tens of thousands of fighters in a couple of weeks with 2,000 skhniki, which of course then they will be sent to the front line, perhaps even without training, or perhaps with insufficient training, in order to restrain the offensive of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Of the important things, it is also worth noting very interesting information that comes from Belarus. We'll be right back. What do we have in Russia? We remember that the United States announced a new package of assistance with the confiscation of Russian assets. Today, information is beginning to arrive that Russia, among other things, is slowly beginning to confiscate frozen Western assets. Russia will prepare for the parade. A large amount of equipment is already being brought back. There is already a large number of broken NATO Western equipment on Poklanaya Square, which anyone can come and see. Well, in other words, the parade is being prepared in full swing. In Belarus, what is important and interesting? There are reports from the President of the Republic of Belarus himself, who reports that according to intelligence, NATO, more precisely, proxies in the NATO force, the forces planned to capture, or planned, perhaps the plans were thwarted, the Kobrin district, after which a referendum was to be held there. The creation of the Kobrin People's Republic is possible, after which the Kobrin, perhaps, People's Republic had to ask for NATO's help to protect, and so on and so forth. Well, this version was provided by the President of the Republic of Belarus today, and the head of the KGB reported that he was prevented. An attempt to strike enough drone with a bucket was prevented, possibly from Lithuania. Well, it's hard to say. We'll watch the story. Maybe something will get. There is also information about the second state in the European Union, which has promised, or, let's say, officially declared the fact that it will help Ukraine to return migrants back to the territory of Ukraine. This has already been reported by a separate, let's say, Lithuania has reported it, and the Polish leadership has already reported it. In other words, I remind you that up to 900,000, let's say, of the Hellions left Ukraine of military age, which, of course, Kiev would like to see on the territory of Ukraine, and best of all on the line of contact. Well, let's watch. Of interest, it is also worth noting Macron's frivolity, which today already reports that Europe needs to be strong. Build a strong Europe, and not be a vassal of the United States of America. Just recently, he was talking back, but they're from the point of view there about Russia, that you need to fight to the end and all the way. There is some news in the United States of America that a large number of ATACMSs have been transmitted from a distance of 300 kilometers, and, of course, strikes on the Crimean Peninsula should be expected in the near future, since drones are already flying here, collecting information. American NATO global hacks are flying and will be here in the near future. Something very big will begin. This is unequivocal. And that's it, dear friends.